Today we will talk about the cell membrane transportation. Eukaryotic cell membrane is made up by a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins that separate the interior component from the surrounding environment. This membrane not only defines the cell boundaries, but also regulates the traffic movement of molecules. Cholesterol here, as we can see at the middle of the hydrophobic tails, is very important to maintain the structural integrity and regulate the fluidity of cell membrane. There are two types of transportation. The first one is passive transportation, which can be categorized into simple diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. The other one is active transportation, which can be categorized into pump and vessel transportation. The passive transportation does not require any energy, but the active transportation required energy, as an example, ATP. Okay, let's start with the passive transport, simple diffusion. Simple diffusion can be happen anytime with or without the cell membrane to reach equilibrium. The small molecules pass naturally through the semi-permeable membrane easily from high concentration to low concentration areas. For example, water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. The second category of passive transportation is called osmosis. Osmosis, on the other hand, the solute cannot pass through the semi-permeable membrane because the molecules are larger than the opening on the membrane. But the solvent, which is water molecules, are small enough to move from low concentration to high concentration area to reach equilibrium without using energy. The last category of passive transportation is called facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion move molecules along the concentration gradient in a specialized way through protein channel in the cell membrane where these proteins work like tunnels that allow large substances like glucose to move in and out of the cell naturally without using energy. There are two kinds of proteins under facilitated diffusion. The first one is carrier protein and the second one is called the channel proteins. Carrier proteins bind solute molecules on one side of a membrane, undergo a conformation change, and release the solute on the other side of the membrane. However, the channel proteins form channels through the membrane to provide a passage route for solutes. Every cell needs water to survive. As a result, aquaporins are transmembrane proteins that regulate the flow of water in and out of the cells. To simplify that, if we don't have these aquaporins, the water will leak from the cell membrane, but in a very slow amount. Carrier proteins alternate between two conformational states. First one, the solute binding site of the protein is accessible on the side of the membrane. Then the protein shifts on the alternate conformation with the solute binding site on the other side of the membrane, triggering the solute release. Carrier proteins are analogous to enzymes. Most ion channels are gated. They open and close in response to stimulus. Voltage-gated channels respond to changes in membrane potential. Ligand-gated channels are triggered by the binding of certain substances to the channel protein. Mechanosensitive channels respond to mechanical forces acting on the membrane. As you can see here from this chart shows the rate of simple diffusion, which is directly proportional to the concentration gradient. Here on the x-axis, you can see the delta S, which is the entropy of solute concentration gradient, and the y-axis shows the V, which is equal to the rate of diffusion. The simple diffusion has a linear relationship between inward flux of solute and the concentration gradient of the solute, which means the bigger the concentration, the faster the diffusion will be. What is active transportation? Active transportation is the second type of cell membrane transportation, which used to move solutes against the concentration gradient using energy. Active transportation performs three cellular functions. The first one, uptake the essential nutrients, then removal of waste. The last one, maintenance of an equilibrium concentration of certain ions. Active transport is unidirectional, which means it only moves in one direction and do not change direction. Active transport is categorized as direct or indirect transport. The direct active transport is the movement of solute molecules to one side of the membrane is coupled directly to the use of ATP. For example, ATPase or ATPase pumps. The second category is indirect active transport. Depends on the stimulus transport of two solutes. Favorable movement of one solute down drives the unfavorable movement of the other to the up. As I said before, indirect active transport is coupled transport, which means two solutes are transported simultaneously and their transport is coupled. The coupled transport can be separated into two categories. The first one is symport and the other one is antiport. The first one is symport if the two solutes are moved in the same direction, and the other one is antiport, which means if the solutes are moved in the other direction, which is the opposite. A good example of that is the sodium ion glucose symporter is a good example of the indirect active transport. There is an unusual active transport. A good example of that is light-driven protein transport in some bacteria is an example of unusual type of transport. For example, Halobacterium salinarium. Phosphorylation of glucose. Glucose can be phosphorylated using hexokinase protein or enzyme with ATP, and ATP turns to ADP as we can see here to get glucose 6 phosphate. The immediate phosphorylation of glucose upon entry into the cell keeps the interior concentration of glucose low. Once phosphorylated, glucose cannot bind the carrier protein any longer and is effectively locked into the cell. As we can see here, our small intestine has a low glucose sodium ion concentration. Also, we can see here that this part shows a unidirectional transportation, which means this part right here is an active transporter. Also, uh, the sodium ion will driven the glucose through the symbol right here to the inside of the cell. As a result, the inside of the cell will have a high glucose sodium ion concentration. So the cell will move glucose to our bloodstream right here at the bottom here, which will be released passively for use by other tissues. Also, the sodium ion right here will be uh, go all the way to the bottom here to our bloodstream to be pumped using sodium potassium ion pump, and this port right here will take potassium ion using antiport active transport, and our bloodstream right here will have a low glucose concentration as we can see. The last category of active transport is vessel transportation. As we can see here on the right picture, it was separated into two types. The first one is called endocytosis, which is the process by which cells absorb external material by engulfing it with the cell membrane. For example, the white blood cells engulfing a virus and eliminating it. The other one is called, which is the opposite, exocytosis. Exocytosis is a form of bulk transport during which large number of molecules are transported out of the cell. For example, hormones and proteins. In summary, this table shows the differences between passive and active transportation, some examples, and the energy used in each of them. As we said before, passive transport is categorized into three parts: simple diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion, a good example of that is the transportation of water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Osmosis is the movement of water for equilibrium. The facilitated diffusion on the bottom here is the movement of water, large molecules like glucose, and ions like sodium, potassium, and calcium ions. There is no need and no requirement for energy use within passive transport. However, active transport can be categorized into two parts. The first one, as we said before, direct transport and indirect transport. The direct transport, a good example of that is ATPases or ATPase bomb, and also endocytosis, exocytosis. The indirect transport, a good example of that is the sodium ion glucose converter. There is always a require for energy within active transportation. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching.